this video, we are going to take a Paylocity API, generate a list of employees, create that into embeddings, and then ingest it into an index that we can use with a chat playground like this one so that we can interact and query that data so that we can get different results from our AI model. Here is a quick overview of the resource group that we will be creating to create this project. The resource group will contain an Azure AI Studio resource, an API connections to connect everything, our logic app, which will store our automation, the Azure OpenAI, which will have our GPT models that we will use and RAG into, and the Azure AI Search, which will hold all our indexes and where we will embed our data into. Here is the Azure AI Search resource. In this resource, we have in the overview, we have the URL that we will be using in the logic app so that we can connect to it. And we also have the key that we can use to authenticate our access to this resource. Inside the indexes, we have created an index. You can create one here using add index or add index JSON. In our index, we can go ahead and click add field here and manually define the names, the type, and the attributes of each field. Or if we have a JSON file that we can use, we can go ahead and go inside add index JSON, and we can paste in our JSON here. An example JSON that I have used is as follows. We have an example body of what we are trying to index into our index. Here on the right is the fields that I have defined for this specific data, right? So we have an ID, company ID, relationship ID, and all our embeddings at the bottom, right? And all of this corresponds to the fields here. So we have the name of our index, the fields that we have defined. So the ID field will be where this ID data will be stored, and so on and so forth. The only thing I have not included is the content vector, and that's what I have added manually. To add a content vector, we go inside of our indexes, we go inside of fields, we add a field, we name the field content vector or whatever you choose. It will be a single collection that is retrievable with the dimensions 1536, and the vector profile will be the default vector profile that we have created here with no configurations. And once we have created that, we can store our embeddings here. So in this resource, it is the Azure AI Hub. In Azure AI Hub, we can go ahead and launch Azure AI Studio, which will take us to a page that looks something like this. It will have all of our connected resources listed here. The most important one being in our playground, we can go ahead and chat with our model. Initially, you won't have a deployment, so you will have to create one. I created a deployment of GPT-4o. You can also create a deployment under the shared resources tab here. Here I have two that I have created, the GPT-4o from earlier, and one called the text embedding ADA002. To deploy the text embedding, you go into deploy model, deploy base model, and then find the text embedding here, right? Once we have created it, we can go inside of our text embedding, and we have a target URI that we will use in our logic app and the key so that we can be authenticated when we use it. This text embedding ADA will take the data that we have received from the Paylocity API and convert it into embeddings, which we can compose into a document so that we can feed it into our Azure AI Search index. In this logic app, it will start with some sort of trigger. The trigger can really be anything. For this specified logic app, it will be a trigger that tells this automation to run once a month, right? So we will get 12 automations a year. We are going to initialize the variables that we need to make our API calls. For the Paylocity API, we're going to need a company ID, the client ID, and the client secret authentication token. This will be different for everybody, but you need to have some variable that will store these values. The next step will be a HTTP request. All the requests will be shown in green. This one will be called post Paylocity token. So we are taking all our initialized variables, we're feeding it into this request to receive an access token that we can use to get our employee response. The access token will look something like this, and we are going to store it. We're going to compose it into a variable called token object. This is just done for organization. It's not necessary, but once we have stored it into token object, we are then going to reference it into our next API called get employees. Get employees, once authenticated with the access token, will return an array of employees, right? So it's going to have an array. In this specific scenario, it will be about 20 employees, and each employee will have its own attributes. With this response state, we're going to do the same thing as above, and we're going to store it into some variable or object that we can reference. Now that we have this array of 20 or so employees, we are going to go into a for while loop. In this loop, we are looping through the array, and at each iteration of the loop, we are referencing a different employee, right? So we're just traversing down through this array. And as we are doing that, we're doing a couple of things. First thing is we're creating an employee object so we can store all our data into. Then we are generating our embeddings. We are going to connect to our ADA, text ADA, so that we can generate our embeddings. Then we are going to compose JSON from the attributes found inside of each iteration of the loop, plus the embeddings. We're going to compose them all into one document, and then we are going to index that document into our Azure Cognitive Search resource. And so here is the logic app. We are going to have our trigger, which as I said, is going to happen once a month. And we are going to have our stored variables of company ID, client ID, and the client secret. Then our first HTTP call will be post Paylocity token. It will take in this URI with this header, and then it'll feed in the body with the client ID and the client secret to produce our API token. The API token will be stored in the token object, and this token object will be used in the get employees HTTP call. This URI will take the company ID, and the bearer access token will reference this token object that we have created to receive an array of the employees inside of the specified company. Once we have the list of employees, we are feeding it into this Paylocity employee list that will hold an array of employees, each having an object with an ID, company ID, relationship ID, and all these different attributes. So once we have that, we are going to save it into an object, and then we are going to loop through each one of our employee list. So we're going through an array, and at each iteration, we are referencing an employee. At each employee, we are creating an object to store all of the data inside. And once we have done that, we're also generating embeddings. So to generate embeddings, we have to use the URI from our Azure AI Hub and the API key that they provide. As I said earlier, this is going to be found here under text embedding ADA. This is the deployment that we have created to create our embeddings. We are going to use this URI and this key to generate our embeddings. Once our embeddings have been generated, it's going to take the body of the employee object. Once it has been generated, we are going to compose a document holding all of the attributes from our employee object, plus the content vector, which is our embeddings. So the content vector would take from generate embeddings. All of these other attributes will be taken from the employee object. We're all going to compose that into a flat JSON and then index it into our Azure AI Search. To index it, we need to connect to this Azure AI resource. And to do so, we go into our Azure AI Hub over here. When we are inside of our Azure AI Search, we can go into Overview. Overview will hold the URL that we need, and under keys will be the key that we need to make this work. Once we have connected with that URL and key, we can just select the index name that we want to index into and the document that we have created here, and then index that respective document. Go ahead and create our project in the AI Studio, right? So under all of our projects, if we don't have a project, we can create a new one, but I have one created here called employee list. Inside of this project, we can do a couple of things. Go ahead and add our data. We don't have one created yet, but we can add a new one, and we can select the data source, which is our Azure AI Search, which is what holds all of our indexes so far. Now that we have this index as our data source, the chat model will know all the respective data inside of that, and we can query some results. The first one we can ask is probably something simple. We can say, what data do you have? And the retrieve documents are going to be the different documents that we have indexes with an example name and position and all the different details. And here I have queried the result to give me the employee contact information, and it will go through its embedded data and find the different employees and their different respective contact information, right? So now we have taken the Paylocity API that just returns an array of employees and their different details, and then we can go ahead and embed it into this model and have created a chat model where we can interface with and query to get different answers. So if this is something of interest to you and you want to do this for your own company, make sure you reach out to Solve Systems so that we can help you with your development needs.